Jane Raymond, a dedicated professional who spent years being the reliable pillar of her family, stands in the back of a seaside chapel. She is forced to watch her identical twin, Janet, marry Jane's own fiancé, Terrence Walker. The betrayal is total. Janet didn't just steal the man. She used their identical looks to gaslight Jane into appearing unstable, while systematically draining Jane's life savings to fund the wedding and a new luxury lifestyle. Amidst her public humiliation, Jane is approached by Seo-jin Lee, Seoul's most powerful and feared billionaire. Years ago, Jane, then a medic, saved Seo-jin's life in a rain-slicked alley in Korea, earning a blood debt he never forgot. Seeing Jane at her lowest, Seo-jin doesn't offer pity. He offers a folder containing the forensic proof of her twin's fraud and a choice. Stay a victim or leave for Seoul to become a strategist capable of taking it all back. Welcome back to the channel. I am so glad you're here for this journey. To my longtime subscribers, thank you for riding with me. Your support is the reason these stories come to life. And if you're new here, welcome to the family. We specialize in stories of high-stakes betrayal, deep emotional justice, and the kind of glow-ups that prove it's never too late to reclaim your power. Today's story is a personal favorite, inspired by everyone who has ever been the reliable one, only to be overlooked. Grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's dive into the world of Jane Raymond and the Dragon of Seoul. The Pacific Ocean was a blurred line of gray and gold through Jane's tears. But as she watched Janet and Terrence celebrate their union, the salt air triggered a memory far colder than the California breeze. To understand how Jane ended up a ghost at her own wedding, you have to understand the year that broke her. It didn't happen with a single blow. It happened in the quiet corners of her own home, through 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed her dry while she was busy being the strong one. 12 months ago, Jane was the pillar of the Raymond family. She was the one who had worked 2 jobs to put herself through her certifications, the one who had quietly paid off her mother's mounting credit card debts, and the one who had provided the down payment for the very house she was eventually kicked out of. Terrence had been her rock, or so she thought. He was the charming, ambitious man who promised that once his tech startup took off, she would never have to work a double shift again. But while Jane was exhausted, coming home from 12-hour days with her scrubs smelling of antiseptic and adrenaline, Janet was there. Janet, the fragile twin, the one who couldn't keep a job because of her anxiety, the one who needed Jane to pay her car insurance, and the one who had spent the last year studying Jane like a predator studies its prey. It started with the accidents. Jane would come home to find her important work documents shredded in the trash. When she'd confront Janet, her twin would look at Terrence with wide, watery eyes and whisper, "I don't know what she's talking about, Terry. Jane, been so stressed lately." I think she's starting to imagine things. Terrence wouldn't defend Jane. Instead, he would place a comforting hand on Janet's shoulder and give Jane a look of profound, patronizing pity. "Maybe you need to see someone, Jane. You're working too hard. You're becoming difficult to be around." By the 6-month mark, the gaslighting had moved from the house to their entire social circle. Jane would arrive at a friend's birthday party only to find everyone looking at her with hushed concern. "We heard you had a breakdown at the office, Jane," her best friend Sarah had whispered. "Janet said you were screaming at the walls. We're just glad you're stable enough to be out in public." Jane had stood there, frozen, realizing that while she was saving lives in the ER, her identical reflection was out in the world, wearing her clothes and using her face to commit social suicide. Janet was playing the role of the worried sister, telling everyone who would listen that Jane was losing her mind. And because Jane was always the one who held everything together, no one could imagine she was the one falling apart, unless someone close to her confirmed it. Terrence was that confirmation. The most calculated move of the year came 4 months before the wedding. Jane had saved $50,000 in a joint account with Terrence, intended for their future home. One evening, she logged in to find the balance at 0. When she confronted Terrence, he didn't flinch. He sat her down and spoke in that same calm, terrifyingly reasonable voice. "Jane, honey, you gave me that money. Don't you remember? You said you wanted to invest it in Janet's new wellness business because you felt guilty for being the successful twin. We talked about this for hours. You even signed the transfer papers." "I never signed anything," Jane had screamed, her voice cracking with the first signs of the instability they wanted from her. "See," Janet had chimed in from the doorway, her voice a poisonous silk. "She's doing it again. The blackouts, Terrence, I'm scared for her." That night, Jane realized that her twin wasn't just stealing her money, she was stealing her sanity. Janet began appearing at Jane's workplace, dressed exactly like her, speaking to her colleagues and subtly making mistakes, charting the wrong medications, being rude to patients, only to vanish before the real Jane arrived for her shift. Jane was called into the administrator's office 3 times in 1 month. Each time she tried to explain she had a twin, and each time the administrator looked at her with the same pity Terrence used. "Jane, we know Janet. She's a lovely girl. She wouldn't do that. We think you're projecting your own exhaustion onto her." The reliability Jane had spent a lifetime building became the cage that trapped her. Because she was the strong twin, her family refused to believe she could be a victim. Her mother, Teresa, was the worst. Whenever Jane tried to point out Janet's lies, Teresa would sigh and rub her temples. "Jane, you've always been jealous of how much everyone loves Janet. You have the career and the money, can't you just let her have this one thing? Stop trying to ruin your sister's reputation just because you're unhappy." By the time the wedding month arrived, Jane was a shell. She was living in a guest room in her own house, watching Terrence and Janet share wedding planning sessions that were supposed to be hers. She was told she was the bridesmaid because she was too stressed to handle the pressure of being the bride. In reality, Janet had already moved into Jane's life entirely. She had taken her place in Terrence's bed, her place in her mother's heart, and her place in the mirror. The final betrayal happened just 48 hours before the ceremony. Jane had walked into the kitchen to find Terrence and Janet laughing, toasted with a bottle of champagne Jane had bought for her own anniversary. "You know," Terrence had said, catching Jane's eye but looking right through her, "it's actually easier this way. Janet doesn't ask questions. She doesn't work until midnight. She's the version of you I always wanted, Jane, the one who's just easy." Jane had walked out of the house then, the sound of her sister's laughter following her like a haunting. She had spent the year being used as a foundation for a life she was no longer allowed to live. She was the one who had paid for the flowers she was currently looking at. She had paid for the navy blue suit Terrence was wearing as he kissed her twin. She had been the reliable one right up until the moment they didn't need her to rely on anymore. As the memory of the gaslight year burned in her chest, Jane's hand tightened on the fabric of her bridesmaid dress. The pain was there, raw and jagged, but something else was beginning to stir. For a year, she had let them define her reality. She had let them tell her she was crazy, jealous, and broken. She looked up, her gaze shifting away from the altar and toward the man in the charcoal suit standing near the surf. Seo-jin Lee hadn't looked away from her once. While her mother, her friends, and her fiancé had spent a year looking at her and seeing a problem to be managed, this stranger was looking at her and seeing a woman of value. He didn't see the unstable twin. He saw the woman who had saved him when the world was dark. Jane took a deep, shuddering breath, the first one that didn't feel like it was drowning her. The gaslight year was over. They had taken her past, her money, and her face. But as she locked eyes with the man from Seoul, she realized they hadn't taken the one thing that actually mattered, her ability to survive. The good twin was dead, buried under the weight of 1,000 lies. And as the applause for the new Mr. and Mrs. Walker reached a crescendo, Jane Raymond decided that if they wanted to see her as a monster, she would show them exactly what a monster looked like when it had nothing left to lose. The reception was a blur of forced laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes. Glasses Jane had paid for with a credit card she now realized was likely maxed out in her name. As the crowd moved toward the shaded pavilion to toast the happy couple, Jane stayed behind. She stepped off the wooden walkway and let her heels sink into the cold, damp sand of the shoreline. The roar of the Pacific was the only thing loud enough to drown out the sound of her own shattering heart. She thought she was alone until the air around her seemed to shift, growing heavy with a sudden, silent authority. A shadow stretched across the sand, long and elegant. Jane didn't turn around. She wiped a stray tear with the back of her hand, bracing herself for her mother to come and tell her to stop making a scene, or for Janet to offer a fake, sugary apology. But the voice that spoke was deep, resonant, and carried an accent that tasted of rain and Seoul's neon-lit nights. "You are wasting your tears on a thief, Jane Raymond. A man who steals a woman's light usually isn't worth the salt in her eyes." Jane froze. She turned slowly, her purple satin dress swirling around her ankles. Standing just 3 feet away was the man in the charcoal suit. Close up, Seo-jin Lee was even more formidable than he had appeared from a distance. His features were carved with a precision that bordered on lethal, a sharp jawline, eyes the color of obsidian, and a stillness that suggested he was the most dangerous thing on this beach, more so than the crashing tide. "I don't know you," Jane whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempt at dignity. "And I certainly didn't invite you to my sister's wedding." "You invited me 3 years ago," Seo-jin said, his gaze never wavering from hers. "In an alley behind a clinic in Myeongdong. You had a medical bag, a steady hand, and a refusal to ask questions while you pulled a bullet out of my shoulder. You told me then that every life was worth saving. I am here to see if you still believe that, now that the life in danger is your own." Jane's breath hitched. The memory flashed back, the smell of iron and rain, the terrified look in a stranger's eyes, and the quiet strength she had felt that night. She had never known his name. She had never expected to see him again. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the waves. Seo-jin didn't reach for a handkerchief to dry her eyes. He didn't offer a platitude about how everything happened for a reason. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a slim, black leather folder. He held it out to her, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with an intense, focused intent. "I do not offer comfort, Jane. Comfort is for the weak, and you have been the strong one for everyone else for far too long. I offer you the truth, and after the truth, I offer you a choice." Jane hesitated, her fingers grazing the cold leather before she took it. "What is this?" "It is the ledger of your life," Seo-jin replied. "Or rather, the record of how it was dismantled while you were looking the other way." With trembling hands, Jane opened the folder. The first page was a bank statement, her primary savings account. She saw the withdrawal she remembered, the one Terrence claimed she had signed for Janet's business. But beneath it was a forensic trail she had never seen. The IP addresses for the transfers didn't match her home or office. They originated from Terrence's laptop at 3 in the morning. As she flipped the pages, the horror deepened. There were documents for a second mortgage on her small condo, signed with a signature that looked exactly like hers, but the date coincided with a night she had been performing a double surgery shift at the hospital. There were credit applications for luxury vehicles, high-end bridal boutiques, and even the catering for this very wedding, all filed under her social security number. "They didn't just take him," Jane whispered, the paper crinkling under her grip. "They took everything. They've ruined my credit. They've stolen my future." "They spent your life to buy their happiness," Seo-jin said, his voice as cold as the sea spray. "Your fiancé didn't invest your money, Jane. He used it to buy the ring he put on your sister's finger this afternoon. Your sister didn't open a wellness business. She used your equity to buy that dress she's currently dancing in." Jane felt a wave of nausea. The gaslighting of the past year finally made sense. The breakdowns they accused her of, the blackouts, it was all a smoke screen to keep her from looking at the numbers. If she was unstable, no one would believe her if she claimed fraud. They had turned her own reputation as a reliable provider into a weapon to strip mine her soul. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jane looked up at him, her eyes red but her spirit beginning to catch fire. "Why wait until they've already said, 'I do'?" "Because a debt is only truly settled when the debtor believes they have one," Seo-jin explained, taking a step closer. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco drifted toward her. "If I had told you yesterday, you would have tried to stop the wedding. You would have pleaded with them. You would have looked for an apology they are not capable of giving. But today they have committed themselves to the lie, and today you have seen their true faces." He gestured toward the pavilion, where Janet was laughing, her head thrown back, a glass of Jane's vintage champagne in her hand. Terrence stood beside her, looking like the king of a mountain built on Jane's back. "They think they have replaced you," Seo-jin continued. "They think you will walk away, broken and bankrupt, too ashamed to fight back. They are counting on your goodness, Jane. They are counting on the fact that you are a nurse who heals, not a woman who destroys." Jane looked down at the folder, then back at the wedding. The pain was still there, but it was being rapidly crowded out by a cold, sharp clarity. She had spent her whole life being the safety net. She had been the person everyone leaned on, the one who fixed the messes, the one who paid the bills. And in return, they had left her for dead on a beach in a bridesmaid dress she had bought for herself. "You said you were offering a choice," Jane said, her voice growing steadier. Seojin nodded. You can take that folder to a lawyer in San Francisco. You can spend the next 10 years in court, fighting for pennies while they move on with their lives. Or you can come with me to Seoul tonight. You can let the world believe Jane Raymond has vanished. And while they think they are safe in the life they stole from you, we will systematically take back every cent, every breath, and every ounce of dignity they took. He held out his hand, not in a gesture of romance, but as a pact. I do not want a victim, Jane. I want the woman who had the courage to save a dying man in a dark alley. If you come with me, I will give you the resources to become their worst nightmare. I will teach you that power is not found in being good. Power is found in being the one who survives. Jane looked at his hand, then back at the chapel. She saw her mother hugging Janet, treating her like the golden child Jane had always tried to be. She saw Terrence whispering in Janet's ear. They looked so happy. They looked so safe. Jane reached out and placed her hand in Seojin's. His grip was firm, radiating a cold, dark promise of protection. The girl who saved you in that alley is gone, Jane said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something harder, something edged in steel. She died this morning at the altar. Seojin's lips curved into the slightest, most dangerous of smiles. Good. I prefer the woman who replaced her. As they walked away from the surf toward the waiting black SUVs, the sounds of the wedding celebration began to fade, replaced by the rising hum of an engine and the first steps of a revenge that would span continents. Jane didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what she was leaving behind, and for the first time in a year, she knew exactly who she was becoming. The hum of the SUV's engine was a low, predatory purr, a stark contrast to the distant, celebratory music still drifting from the beach. As Jane settled into the buttery leather seat, the scent of the interior, expensive wood and cold iron, pulled her mind back, away from the California sun and into the rain-slicked memory of a night 3 years ago. To understand the weight of the man sitting beside her, she had to remember the night she had first seen him, not as a titan of industry, but as a man bleeding out in the dark. It had been a night of oppressive humidity in Seoul, the kind that made the neon lights of Myeongdong bleed into the pavement like spilled ink. Jane, then a young medical volunteer working late shifts at a small, underfunded community clinic, had been walking home through a shortcut, a narrow alleyway choked with steam from nearby kitchen vents and the smell of wet asphalt. She had been exhausted, her mind preoccupied with the modest life she was building and the sister she was already sending half her paycheck to. Then she heard it, a ragged, wet cough that didn't sound human. In the shadows behind a stack of rusted shipping crates, she found him. Seojin Lee didn't look like a king then. His charcoal suit, likely worth more than Jane's entire education, was shredded and soaked through with a terrifying amount of blood. He was slumped against a brick wall, a jagged wound in his shoulder pulsing rhythmically, and his face was a mask of pale, lethal sweat. Even then, facing death, his eyes had been terrifying, sharp black glass that refused to shatter. Most people would have run. Most would have called the police and vanished. But Jane's hands had moved before her brain could register the danger. She had dropped her medical bag, the one she carried everywhere, and knelt in the filth beside him. "Don't touch me," he had rasped, the sound like grinding stones. He had tried to raise a hand, perhaps to push her away or perhaps to strike, but his strength failed him. "I'm a medic," Jane had replied, her voice steady with the clinical calm that would later become her cage. "And if I don't touch you, you'll be dead before the rain stops. Keep your hand on the wound. Press down. Harder." For the next 40 minutes, the world had shrunk to the size of that alleyway. Jane had worked with a frantic, precise grace, ignoring the distant sirens and the shouting of men searching the nearby streets. She had used her only bottle of sterile water to flush the wound, her hands steady as she threaded a needle by the flickering light of a broken overhead lamp. She didn't have anesthesia. She didn't have a sterile theater. She only had her skill and the strange, magnetic intensity of the man who watched her every move with a silent, agonizing focus. Every time the needle pierced his skin, he didn't scream. He simply tightened his jaw until Jane thought the bone might snap. "Why?" he had managed to ask as she wrapped the final bandage, her own white coat now stained a deep, indelible crimson. "You know who I am. You saw the tattoos. You saw the men chasing me." Jane had looked him in the eye as she packed her bag, her hands finally starting to shake now that the work was done. "I don't care who you are. I care that you're a life. In my world, we don't pick and choose who deserves to keep breathing. We just try to make sure they do." She had stayed with him until the sound of black cars approached, not the police, but his own people. As a fleet of SUVs identical to the one she sat in now had swerved into the alley, Jane had stood up, preparing to vanish into the night. Before she could leave, a hand had clamped around her wrist. It wasn't the grip of a dying man anymore, it was the grip of a survivor. Seo-jin had looked up at her, the color slowly returning to his face, his gaze pinning her to the spot. "You saved a man who does not deserve mercy," he had said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to echo off the damp walls. "The world will try to punish you for your kindness, Jane Raymond. People like you, the good ones, you are the easiest to break." He had reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy coin made of dark, unpolished gold, pressing it into her palm. "I do not forget a debt. One day the people you care for will turn their backs. One day your goodness will become your greatest weakness. When that day comes, find me. Until then, remember this. I am a man of blood, but I am a man of my word. One day I will be your shield." Jane had kept that coin in the back of her jewelry box for 3 years. She had looked at it on the nights she felt lonely, on the nights Terrence stayed out late working, and on the nights Janet had cried to her about her latest failure. She had never thought she would actually need a shield. She had thought her own strength, her own goodness, would be enough to protect her. But sitting in the SUV now, Jane realized that Seo-jin had seen her more clearly in those 40 minutes than her family had in a lifetime. He had known that a heart like hers was a target. He had known that the people she carried would eventually try to crush her under their weight. She looked at Seo-jin now, his profile sharp against the passing scenery of the California coast. He was no longer the bleeding man in the alley. He was the shield he had promised to be. "You knew," Jane said, her voice a quiet realization. "You knew they would do this to me." Seo-jin didn't look away from the road, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I knew the nature of the people you surrounded yourself with. Parasites do not stop until the host is empty, Jane. I simply waited for you to realize you were the host." He turned to her then, and for a moment, the charcoal-suited businessman vanished, and the man from the alley returned. The one who understood that survival was the only true currency. "The blood debt is not paid by me simply standing here," he said. "It is paid by me giving you the sword to match the shield. We are going to Seoul, Jane. And by the time we are finished, the name Raymond will no longer mean the reliable twin. It will mean the woman who burnt down everything that tried to consume her." Jane looked out the window as they approached the private terminal. The Pacific Ocean was behind them now, along with the wedding, the lies, and the woman who had been too good for her own safety. The memory of the alley stayed with her, but it no longer felt like a secret burden. It felt like a foundation. She had saved his life once. Now she was going to let him save hers. But as the plane's engines began to roar, Jane knew that this was the last time she would ever need saving. From now on, she would be the one who dictated who lived and who fell. The celebration behind them was reaching its crescendo, the clinking of glasses and rhythmic thumping of dance music bleeding into the sound of the Pacific surf. But Jane didn't look back. She walked away from the white floral arch and the family that had traded her soul for a more compliant version, her purple satin dress snapping in the wind like a battle flag. By the time the first slice of wedding cake was served, a cake bought with the last of her drained savings, Jane Raymond was already miles away, sitting in the back of a black SUV that moved through the California twilight like a ghost. The transition from the world of suburban betrayal to the world of Seo-jin Lee was silent and absolute. They pulled onto a private tarmac where a sleek, obsidian-colored jet waited, its engines already whining with a low, impatient hunger. The aircraft bore no markings, no logos, only a sense of quiet, terrifying power. As the stairs retracted and the heavy cabin door sealed shut with a pressurized hiss, the air inside changed. It was filtered, cool, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and old-world secrets. Jane sank into a wide cream-colored seat, the folder Seo-jin had given her still clutched in her lap like a weapon. Across from her, Seo-jin removed his charcoal jacket, revealing the crisp line of his shirt and the quiet confidence of a man who moved the world from the shadows. "We will be in Seoul in 13 hours, he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the ascent. During that time, you have a choice to make. You can spend these hours grieving for the man who stole your past, or you can begin studying the man who is going to help you take back your future. Jane looked out the small oval window. Below, the lights of San Francisco were shrinking into a glittering grid of broken promises. She thought of Terrence, who at this very moment was likely toastying to his new life, unaware that the foundation he stood upon was already beginning to erode. She thought of Janet, who wore Jane's face and Jane's ring, thinking she had won a prize when she had actually only inherited a debt. "I'm done grieving," Jane said, her voice surprisingly steady. She turned her gaze back to Seojin. "I spent a year being the good twin. I spent a year making excuses for people who were plotting my ruin. If being a good person means standing in the back of a church while your life is auctioned off to the highest bidder, then I don't want to be good anymore." Seojin's eyes glinted with a dark approval. "Good. Loyalty is a virtue, Jane, but only when it is reciprocal. When it is one-sided, it is a suicide pact. Your family and your fiancé didn't just betray you, they gambled on your silence. They believed you were too moral, too soft, to ever strike back. They treated your character like a weakness they could exploit." He leaned forward, his presence filling the cabin. "To beat a monster like Terrence, a man who uses a woman's heart as a stepping stone, you cannot fight with the tools of a nurse. You cannot heal a cancer that wants to consume you. You have to be more dangerous than the thing that hunts you. In my world, they call me the Dragon of Soul, not because I am cruel, but because I understand that some things must be burned to the ground before something new can grow." Jane felt a shiver of realization. For years, she had tried to be a healer in a house of arsonists. She had patched up the wounds Janet and Terrence inflicted, only for them to turn around and cut her deeper. To survive this, she didn't need another medical kit. She needed a flame. She needed the dragon. "Teach me," Jane whispered. "Teach me how to make them feel what I felt today. Not just the loss, but the realization that they never really knew who I was." Seojin reached for a glass of dark liquid on the table between them, but his focus remained entirely on her. "It starts with the erasure. Tonight, Jane Raymond, the reliable ER nurse, the dutiful daughter, the jilted bride, ceases to exist. We will let the police reports of your disappearance gather dust. We will let Janet and Terrence settle into their stolen life. We will let them get comfortable in their greed." He tapped the black folder. "While they are busy spending what is left of your money, we will be dismantling their infrastructure. I will show you how to move through the world unseen. I will give you access to accounts they cannot track and influence they cannot fathom. But in exchange, you must promise me one thing." Jane met his gaze, her jaw set. "Anything." "You must never go back to being the girl in the alley," Seojin said, his voice dropping to a low, warning vibration. "The world is not a clinic, Jane. You cannot save everyone. When the time comes to pull the trigger on their downfall, you cannot hesitate because you remember their better days. You must be as cold as the iron I felt when you saved me." Jane looked at her hands. They were the hands of a woman who had spent a decade holding people together. Now, as the plane leveled out over the dark expanse of the Pacific, she felt them hardening. The grief was being replaced by a cold, surgical precision. She was no longer running away from her life. She was retreating to higher ground. "They didn't just take my money and my man, Seojin," Jane said, her voice dropping an octave, echoing the steel in his own. "They took my name. They used my face to make me look like a ghost. If I'm going to be a ghost, then I'm going to be the kind that haunts them until they have nothing left." Seojin nodded slowly. He signaled to a flight attendant, who brought a second glass. He handed it to Jane, a silent toast to the pact they had made in the sand. "To the resurrection," he said quietly. Jane took a sip. It was bitter and strong, a taste of the world she was entering. As the midnight sun hung somewhere beyond the horizon, Jane realized she wasn't afraid of the dragon anymore. She was realizing that the only way to survive a monster was to become the person who controlled the fire. The flight to Seoul was 13 hours, but for Jane, it was the distance between a victim and a victor. By the time they touched down in the neon heart of Korea, the Jane Raymond who had cried on a beach would be a memory. The woman who stepped off that plane would be someone Janet and Terrence wouldn't recognize, even if she was wearing their own face. The skyscraper in the heart of Seoul's Gangnam district stood like a pillar of obsidian against the morning sky, its glass reflecting a world that was moving on without Jane Raymond. Inside the climate-controlled silence of Seojin Lee's private office, the only sound was the rhythmic tapping of a stylus against a tablet. Jane sat across from the man they called the Dragon, no longer dressed in purple satin, but in a structured black blazer that felt like a suit of armor. On the screens surrounding them, the perfect lives of Terrence and Janet Walker were laid bare in high-definition data. Seojin didn't believe in the loud, messy confrontation of a courtroom. He believed in the quiet, absolute erasure of a person's foundation. "Revenge is not a scream, Jane," he said, his voice as calm as the tea steaming on the low table between them. "It is the sound of a door locking from the outside while the person inside still thinks they hold the key. They spent a year making you a ghost. Now we will make their reality an illusion." With a single swipe of his hand, Seojin brought up a satellite image of the sleek 3-bedroom house in San Francisco, the one Jane had paid the down payment for, the one where Janet and Terrence were currently waking up as newlyweds. "They think they own this roof," Seojin murmured. "But at 9:01 this morning, the holding company that owned their mortgage was acquired by a subsidiary of my firm. They no longer owe the bank, Jane. They owe me, and I am not a patient lender." Jane watched the screen, her heart hammering a steady, cold rhythm. She remembered the nights she had worked overtime to ensure that mortgage was paid, only to be told by Terrence that she was bad with money. Now, Terrence would find out what it truly meant to be at the mercy of a creditor. But the erasure was only beginning. Seojin moved his fingers across the screen to the digital profiles of their professional lives. Terrence, the ambitious tech consultant who had used Jane's social standing to climb the ladder, was currently celebrating a major promotion at a boutique firm. Janet, who had used Jane's identity to secure a high-end lease for a lifestyle boutique that she had no intention of actually running, was already planning her first launch party. "Janet's boutique lease was signed using your credit profile," Seojin noted, his eyes narrowing. "To the world, it looks like you are the one failing. But today, the commercial real estate group that owns that storefront has moved her file to high-risk audit. Every cent she spends from this moment forward will be flagged as a potential felony. She is walking into a trap she built for you." As for Terrence, the blow was even more surgical. Seojin had tracked the venture capital firm that was about to fund Terrence's new startup. With a few encrypted messages, Seojin had ensured that the funding was contingent on a deep-dive background integrity check. A check that would be performed by a security firm Seojin owned. Terrence's history of borrowing Jane's assets was about to become a public liability. "They believe they are standing on a mountain," Jane said, her voice sounding different to her own ears, sharper, less burdened by the need to be liked. "But you've turned it into a glass floor." "Exactly," Seojin replied. "A cage made of debt and broken promises. They will continue to live in that house, drive those cars, and post their happy photos to social media. But every time they swipe a card, a notification will hit my desk. Every time they plan for the future, they are actually just borrowing more time from a clock that has already run out." Jane leaned back, a strange sense of weightlessness washing over her. For a year, she had been the one looking over her shoulder, wondering why her life was falling apart. She had been the one gaslit into believing she was the problem. Now, the roles were being meticulously reversed. Seojin wasn't just taking their money, he was taking their peace. He was creating a world where they would have to check the locks every night, where every phone call would make their stomachs drop, and where they would eventually turn on each other when the walls started closing in. "They won't see it coming, will they?" Jane asked. "Not until it is too late to run," Seojin said. He handed her a second tablet, this one showing a live social media feed. Janet had just posted a photo of her and Terrence on their honeymoon deck, overlooking the bay. The caption read, "Finally exactly where I'm supposed to be." Jane looked at her twin's face, her own face, smiling back at the camera with a smug, stolen satisfaction. A year ago, that image would have sent Jane into a spiral of tears. Now, it just felt like looking at a target. "She thinks she's exactly where she's supposed to be," Jane whispered, a cold, elegant smile touching her lips. "She's right. She's exactly where we can find her." Seojin watched her, a flicker of something like pride in his obsidian eyes. "The erasure is a process, Jane. It starts with their assets, moves to their reputation, and ends with their sanity. They took your name to hide their crimes. We will give them back their names, but we will make sure those names are synonymous with ruin. As the morning sun climbed higher over Seoul, Jane realized that the good twin hadn't just disappeared. She had been forged into something much more durable. She was no longer a victim waiting for an apology. She was the architect of a slow-motion disaster. For the first time in a year, she wasn't worried about the next bill or the next lie. She was simply waiting for the first crack to appear in the glass floor. The dragon had begun his work, and Jane was no longer afraid of the fire. She was the one holding the match. The penthouse training room was a sanctuary of glass and steel, suspended high above the glittering arteries of Seoul. For Jane, the weeks that followed her arrival weren't spent in spas or luxury boutiques, though the silk and tailored wool she now wore felt like a second skin. Her transformation was far more visceral. It was a reconstruction of the mind. Seo-jin didn't want to just dress a victim in expensive clothes. He wanted to sharpen the woman who had already shown she could handle a blade in a dark alley. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting over the city he ruled. In San Francisco, you were a nurse, Jane. You were trained to respond to crises, to patch wounds, to wait for instructions. But here, you are the crisis. You are the one who dictates the pace of the room. He placed a tablet on the marble table between them. It was a live feed of Janet's boutique back home. Watch your sister. What do you see? Jane looked at the screen. Janet was laughing with a group of socialites, her gestures wide and performative. She was wearing Jane's favorite necklace, a graduation gift from their grandmother. A month ago, seeing that would have made Jane's throat tighten with a sense of loss. Now, she simply narrowed her eyes. She's overcompensating, Jane said, her voice dropping into a lower, more analytical register. She's spending too much time talking about her success and not enough time checking the inventory. She's leaning on the Raymond name because she knows she hasn't built anything of her own. Correct, Seo-jin replied, a flicker of approval in his dark eyes. She is playing a role, and because she is playing a role, she is predictable. People who act on emotion can be led. People who act on strategy can lead. You spent your whole life reacting to Janet's emergencies. You let her chaos dictate your schedule. From this moment on, you do not react. You observe, you calculate, and you move only when the result is guaranteed. The training was grueling. Seo-jin pushed her to understand the cold mechanics of influence, how to read a room, how to identify the person with the most to lose, and how to use silence as a weapon. He taught her that being nice was often just a lack of boundaries, and that being kind required the power to say no. One evening, after a long day of studying corporate structures and the legal loopholes Terrence had used to drain her accounts, Jane found Seo-jin in the library. He was cleaning a small, ornate dagger, his movements rhythmic and meditative. "Why are you doing this for me, Seo-jin?" she asked, standing in the doorway. "A blood debt from an alley 3 years ago. You could have just given me a check and sent me on my way. Why turn me into this?" Seo-jin looked up, the lamplight catching the sharp planes of his face. "Because I saw a spark in that alley that you had spent years trying to extinguish in the name of goodness. I saw a woman who could stare down death without blinking. The world has enough nurses, Jane. It has very few queens. And I found myself curious to see what would happen if the woman who saved the dragon finally decided to stop being a sacrifice." He walked toward her, the weight of his presence filling the space between them. "They used your face because they thought you were the weaker version. They thought if they stole the exterior, the interior wouldn't matter. We are going to prove them wrong. We are going to make it so that when they look at your face in the mirror, they don't see their victory. They see their executioner." Jane felt the words settle into her bones. The glow-up was happening in the way she stood, the way she no longer apologized for taking up space, and the way she looked at the folder of Terrence's debts. She was no longer Jane the reliable. She was becoming Jane the inevitable. She spent her nights learning the intricacies of the global market Seo-jin moved in. She learned that Terrence's tech startup was built on a foundation of stolen ideas, concepts Jane had mentioned to him during late-night dinners, which he had packaged and sold as his own. She learned that Janet had been forging Jane's signatures on more than just credit cards. She had been signing Jane's name to unethical business practices that would eventually trigger a federal audit. "You aren't just going to take their money, are you?" Jane asked one night as they reviewed the final phase of the social erasure. "I am going to take their air," Seo-jin replied. I am going to make it so that every door they try to open is locked, every friend they try to call is busy, and every path they take leads back to us. But the final blow, Jane, that must come from you. Power is only realized when the person who is wronged is the one who delivers the consequence. Jane walked over to a mirror in the training room. She looked at herself, really looked at herself, for the first time in weeks. The exhaustion was gone. The desperation that had haunted her eyes on the beach had been replaced by a quiet, focused fire. She wore a deep emerald suit that complemented her skin, and a gaze that suggested she knew exactly what everyone in the room was thinking. She wasn't Janet. She wasn't the other twin. She was the original. "I'm ready," Jane said, her voice as steady as it had been in the alley 3 years ago. Seo-jin stood behind her, his reflection looming over hers like a dark, protective shadow. "Good, because tomorrow, the investors from Seoul make their first contact with Terrence Walker. He's been looking for a savior to bail out his failing firm. He has no idea he's about to invite the dragon into his home." Jane didn't smile, but she felt a cold satisfaction blooming in her chest. The training was over. She had stopped being the girl who patched up the world's wounds and started being the woman who decided who got to stay in the light. Janet and Terrence had spent a year playing with her life like it was a game. Now, Jane was the one holding the deck, and she was about to show them exactly how it felt to lose everything to a woman they thought they had already killed. The nice twin was gone. The strategist had arrived. The fog rolling off the San Francisco Bay was thick and cold, but inside the gilded ballroom of the Fairmont, the air was suffocating with the scent of lilies and desperation. Terrence Walker adjusted his cufflinks, his hands shaking slightly as he scanned the room. Beside him, Janet looked every bit the successful entrepreneur in a shimmering gold gown, one that Jane had once bookmarked for her own engagement party. But the gold couldn't hide the frantic tightness around her eyes. Their perfect life was leaking from every seam. The boutique was empty, the mortgage notices were arriving in bright red envelopes, and Terrence's venture capital partners had gone silent, citing integrity concerns they wouldn't explain. They were two people drowning in a sea of champagne, waiting for a miracle they didn't deserve. "Smile, Terry," Janet hissed, her voice a sharp contrast to her bright, performative grin. "If the board sees us looking like this, the funding is dead. We just need one big investor to see the potential of the brand." "I'm smiling," Terrence snapped, though his eyes remained hollow. "But I haven't seen a single checkbook all night. Everyone is talking about the delegation from Seoul. They say the head of Kang Global is looking for a domestic partner. If we can get 5 minutes with him, we're saved." As if summoned by his desperation, the heavy oak doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open. The room, which had been a cacophony of networking and jazz, suddenly fell into a rhythmic, curious hush. It wasn't just the arrival of a guest, it was the arrival of an event. First came the security, 4 men in identical dark suits, their movements as precise and lethal as a military drill. Then came Seo-jin Lee. He moved with a predatory grace that made everyone else in the room look like they were standing still. He wore charcoal wool so fine it looked like liquid, but it was the woman on his arm who turned the air into glass. She wore a gown of deep, midnight emerald that caught the light like the surface of a deep-sea trench. Her hair was styled in a sharp, clinical bob that emphasized the lethal perfection of her jawline. She moved with a confidence that didn't just suggest she owned the room. It suggested she was the reason the room existed. From the center of the floor, Janet's glass of champagne slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. "Terrence," Janet whispered, her face draining of color until she looked like a wax figure. "Terrence, look at her." Terrence turned, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. For a year, he had convinced himself that Jane was a broken, unstable memory. He had told the world she had suffered a breakdown and fled. But the woman walking toward them didn't have a single crack in her. She had the same face as the wife standing beside him, yet they looked nothing alike. Janet looked like a cheap imitation, a flickering candle standing next to a star. Jane didn't rush. She didn't look for a confrontation. Following Seo-jin's lead, she moved through the crowd, accepting the greetings of city officials and tech moguls with a cool, aristocratic nod. She was no longer the nurse who waited for permission to speak. She was the strategist, the silent partner of the most powerful man in Korea, and she was playing the room like a grand master. It can't be her, Terrence stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Jane is. She's gone. She's bankrupt. She's probably in some shelter. It's a coincidence. A coincidence with my face. Janet's voice was a panic trill. She's wearing my face, Terrence, and she's with him. As the crowd parted, Seojin and Jane stopped just 10 feet from the walkers. Seojin's obsidian eyes swept over Terrence and Janet with a look of profound, clinical boredom, as if he were inspecting two insects on a windshield. Mr. Walker, Seojin said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I understand you have been looking for an injection of capital for your fledgling enterprise. Terrence stepped forward, his professional instinct briefly overriding his terror. Mr. Lee, yes, Terrence Walker, I've prepared a brief on the scalability of our. I am not interested in your brief, Seojin interrupted, his gaze shifting to the woman at his side. I am only here because my senior associate suggested that your firm had assets worth recovering. Jane stepped forward then, moving into the light of the chandelier. She looked directly at Janet. She didn't see a sister. She didn't see a twin. She saw a debt that had finally come due. The good twin would have cried. The reliable twin would have asked why. But Jane simply looked at the grandmother's pearls Janet was wearing, the ones Janet had stolen from Jane's jewelry box the day of the wedding. The pearls look heavy on you, Janet, Jane said. Her voice wasn't the soft, empathetic tone Janet remembered. It was like the edge of a scalpel, thin, sharp, and cold. But then, everything you've stolen has always been a bit too much for you to carry, hasn't it? The surrounding guests leaned in, the scent of scandal more intoxicating than the wine. Janet gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Jane, what is this? Where have you been? We were so worried. We thought you had a mental break. Jane's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile she had practiced under Seojin's tutelage until it was a weapon. I didn't have a break, Janet. I had an awakening. And as for where I've been buying your world. She turned her gaze to Terrence, who looked as though he might collapse. Your office lease, Terrence, the one you signed last week, it was acquired by Kang Global. Your mortgage? My associate here is now your landlord. Even the caterers for this evening are currently being paid by a subsidiary I manage. Jane leaned in, her voice dropping so that only the four of them could hear. You spent a year making me a ghost so you could live in my house and spend my money. But the problem with ghosts, Terrence, is that eventually they learn how to haunt. And I have spent the last few months learning how to haunt you until you have nothing left but the clothes on your backs. Seojin placed a hand on the small of Jane's back, a gesture of absolute possession and protection. We will be in the city for 3 days, he said to the room at large, though his eyes remained on the crumbling couple. By the end of the week, the Walker name will be an interesting footnote in the history of San Francisco's failures. Come, Jane, we have more important people to meet. As they walked away, Jane felt the heat of 100 eyes on her, but the only ones that mattered were the 2 pairs of terrified, identical eyes she left behind. For a year, they had used her goodness as a shield. Now she had returned with a dragon at her side, and the shield had become a cage. The return to San Francisco wasn't about a reunion. It was about the first move in a game they had already lost. Jane Raymond had come home, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't there to save anyone. She was there to collect. The silence that followed Jane's exit from the ballroom was a vacuum, pulling the oxygen out of the room and leaving Terrence and Janet gasping in the wake of her emerald shadow. For the next hour, they were the center of a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for a sinking ship. The whispers of the elite were no longer curious, they were predatory. By the time the gala began to wind down, Terrence was packing the marble hallway of the Fairmont's private mezzanine, his phone vibrating with a relentless series of alerts. Each one was a fresh wound. His lead developer had just resigned, his corporate credit cards were being declined for irregularity, and a process server had just left a message at his office. Janet sat on a velvet settee, her gold dress looking tarnished in the dim hallway light. She was staring at her own reflection in a gilded mirror, her hands shaking so violently that the pearls around her neck clattered like dry bones. It's not possible, she whispered, her voice a thin, cracked reed. She was broken, Terrence. We broke her. How is she standing there like she owns the world? She doesn't just own the world, Janet, Terrence snapped, his voice tight with a terror he could no longer mask. "She owns us. Did you hear him? Lee said he's our landlord. He's our creditor. He's the one who's been strangling my startup for months." Before Janet could respond, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall opened. They expected security, or perhaps a waiter with a bill they couldn't pay. Instead, a single figure walked in. She wasn't accompanied by Seojin Lee this time. She didn't need a shield. Jane walked into the room with a quiet, lethal grace that made the air feel suddenly too thin. She had changed out of the emerald gown and into a structured white suit that looked like it had been carved from a single block of marble. It was the same shade as a wedding dress, but on Jane, it didn't signal a beginning. It signaled a reckoning. As she moved into the light, the effect was hypnotic. Looking at her and Janet in the same room was like looking at a masterpiece beside a counterfeit. They had the same deep brown skin, the same expressive eyes, and the same elegant features. But while Janet's face was etched with the frantic lines of a woman who had spent her life pretending, Jane's face was a study in absolute, terrifying clarity. She didn't just look like the woman they had betrayed. She looked like the person they were always afraid she could become. Terrence stood frozen, his breath hitching. For a year, he had convinced himself that he had made the smart choice. He had traded Jane, the woman who challenged him, the woman who worked as hard as he did, the woman who held him to a standard of integrity, for Janet, the easy version. He had wanted a woman he could control, a woman who would look at him with unearned adoration while he spent her sister's money. But looking at Jane now, radiating a cold, sovereign power, the realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't traded difficult for easy. He had traded a diamond for a piece of glass. He had traded a woman who could build empires for a woman who could only haunt them. "Jane," Terrence managed to say, his voice failing him. He took a half-step toward her, his instinct for self-preservation prompting a pathetic, charming smile that died before it could reach his eyes. "Jane, we need to talk. This has all been a massive misunderstanding. The money, the wedding. We were just trying to protect you. We thought you were having a crisis, and we didn't want you to worry about the..." Jane didn't wait for him to finish. She didn't even acknowledge the lie. She simply walked past him, her scent, sandalwood and something cold, like ozone, lingering in the air. She stopped in front of her twin. Janet looked up, her eyes wide with a primal fear. "What do you want, Jane? You've already humiliated us. You've taken our reputation. Isn't that enough?" "Humiliation is a temporary state, Janet," Jane said, her voice a low, melodic vibration that made the fine hairs on Janet's arms stand up. "I'm not interested in your feelings. I'm interested in the truth. For 25 years, you used our face as a mask to hide your failures. You used my reliability as a bank account you never intended to repay. And on our wedding day, you didn't just take a husband. You tried to take my very existence." Jane leaned down, her face inches from her sister. To any observer, it would have looked like a woman whispering to her own reflection. "I spent a year wondering what I did wrong. I spent a year believing I was the broken one, but Seojin taught me something you'll never understand, Janet. Power isn't something you steal. It's something you are. You could wear my clothes, sleep in my bed, and use my name, but you could never be me. Because to be me, you have to be able to survive the dark. And you're just a shadow that disappears the moment the lights go out." Jane stood up and turned to Terrence. He was looking at her with a hunger that made her skin crawl, a sudden, desperate regret. He saw the woman she was now, the woman backed by the wealth of soul and the steel of a dragon, and he realized he had thrown away the only thing in his life that was actually real. "I made a mistake, Jane," Terrence whispered, his voice cracking. "I see that now, Janet. She's not you, she never was. If you could just give me a chance to fix this. If we can just talk to Seojin." Jane looked at him with a look of profound, clinical boredom. It was the same look Seojin used on his enemies, and in that moment the transformation was complete. She didn't hate him. Hate was an emotion for equals. She simply didn't care. "You didn't make a mistake, Terrence," Jane said. "You made a choice. You chose the version of a woman you thought you could break, and in doing so, you lost the only woman who would have ever walked through the fire for you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single, unpolished dark gold coin, the one Seojin had given her in the alley. She tossed it onto the velvet settee between them. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "That coin is worth more than everything you have left," Jane said. "Which is to say, it is worth nothing to you, because the man who issued it doesn't accept payment from cowards. He only accepts it from survivors. She turned and began to walk toward the exit. Her pace was even, her shoulders back, her silhouette a sharp white line against the darkness of the hallway. "Jane," Janet screamed behind her, the sound of her sister finally breaking. "Where are you going? You can't just leave us like this." Jane didn't stop. She didn't look back at the mirror image she had finally outgrown. "I'm not leaving you, Janet," Jane said, her voice carrying back through the stillness of the mezzanine. "I'm just finishing the erasure. By tomorrow morning, the woman you tried to replace won't just be gone. She'll be the one who owns the ground you're standing on. Sleep well. It's the last night you'll spend in a bed I paid for." As the doors closed behind her, Jane felt a strange, quiet peace settle over her. The reveal wasn't for them. It was for her. She had looked into the eyes of her betrayers and felt nothing but the cold, steady strength of her own heart. She walked toward the elevator where Seo-jin was waiting, his dark eyes watching her with a silent, fierce pride. The diamond had been cut, the glass had been shattered, and for the first time in her life, Jane Raymond was whole. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Kang Global Building was a temple of glass and cold, gray stone, overlooking a city that now belonged to a version of Jane Raymond the world had never seen. The air inside was pressurized and silent, broken only by the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen. Across the massive obsidian table, Terrence and Janet looked like ghosts of their former selves. The gold gown Janet had worn to the gala was gone, replaced by a cheap, wrinkled blazer she had likely pulled from the back of a closet she no longer technically owned. Terrence's navy wedding suit was stained at the cuffs, his tie loosened as if it were a noose. Seo-jin Lee sat at the head of the table, a silent, dark-suited shadow of authority. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The thick stack of legal documents between them, detailing identity theft, grand larceny, and corporate fraud, spoke with a roar that had silenced the Walkers' last attempts at excuses. "Sign the final page, Mr. Walker," the lead attorney said, his voice as clinical as a surgical strike. "By signing, you acknowledge the full transfer of all assets, including the San Francisco property, the liquidated boutique funds, and the intellectual property rights to the startup. In exchange, the criminal complaints for felony fraud and identity theft will be stayed, contingent on your immediate departure from the state." Terrence's hand trembled so violently the pen clattered against the table. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, seeking Jane's gaze. For a second, his old mask tried to slip back on the look of the charming, misunderstood man who just needed one more chance. "Jane," he choked out, his voice cracking. "We were family. We can't start over with nothing. Please, just the car. Let us keep the car so we can get to Janet's mother's place." Jane sat perfectly still, her hands folded over the black leather folder Seo-jin had given her on that beach a lifetime ago. She looked at Terrence, and for the first time in a year, she didn't feel the sharp, jagged edge of betrayal. She didn't feel the heat of anger or the cold hollow of grief. She felt nothing but a profound, weary distance. She looked at the man she had once planned to spend her life with and realized he was small. He wasn't the titan she had built him up to be. He was just a man who stole from women because he wasn't strong enough to build anything for himself. "The car was bought with my credit, Terrence," Jane said. Her voice was a calm, steady stream that didn't ripple with a single emotion. "The shoes you're wearing were bought with my overtime pay. The very air you're breathing in this room is being paid for by my partner. You aren't starting over with nothing. You are simply returning what was never yours." Janet let out a broken, high-pitched sob, her head dropping onto the table. "You're a monster, Jane. You're our own blood. How can you sit there with that man, and watch us lose everything?" Jane turned her gaze to her twin. She looked at the face that was identical to her own, and she no longer saw a mirror. She saw a cautionary tale. Janet had spent her life trying to skip the work, trying to wear the crown without ever fighting the battle. She had stolen Jane's face because she was too afraid to find her own. "I'm not watching you lose everything, Janet," Jane said softly. "I'm watching you become who you actually are without me to carry you. You wanted my life. This is the reality of it, the responsibility, the debt, the consequences. You just forgot that the good twin was the only thing keeping the roof over your head." With a final, jagged scrawl, Terrence signed the last document. He pushed it toward the center of the table as if it were a poisonous snake. It was over. The erasure was complete. In the eyes of the law, the bank, and the world, Janet and Terrence Walker were officially non-entities. They had the clothes on their backs and the shame in their chests, and nothing else. Terrence stood up, his chair screeching against the marble floor. He looked at Jane one last time, a desperate, pathetic hope flickering in his eyes. Now that you have it all back, now that you've won, what are you going to do, Jane? You're alone, you've burnt every bridge, is it worth it? Jane stood up then, her movements fluid and sovereign. She didn't look at the stack of papers that gave her back her money. She didn't look at the deed to the house or the keys to the life they had stolen. She looked past them, toward the window where the sun was beginning to set over the Pacific, turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold. I didn't do this to win, Terrence, Jane said. I did this to be free, and as for being alone... She turned to Seojin, who had risen silently beside her. He didn't offer a platitude or a hand to hold. He simply stood as her equal, his presence a dark, immovable shield that no longer needed to be tested. I have finally found the only person in this world who sees me as a protagonist, not a resource. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking a sharp, confident rhythm against the stone. She didn't look back as Terrence and Janet were ushered out by security through the service entrance. She didn't need to see their exit to know it was final. As they reached the elevator, Seojin pressed the button for the helipad. He turned to her, his obsidian eyes searching hers. The debt is settled, Jane. Your name is clear. Your accounts are full. You could stay here. You could go back to the clinic. You could be the good twin again. Jane looked at her reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. She saw a woman who had survived the dark, a woman who had been forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered in the cold waters of Seoul. The nurse who patched up everyone else's wounds was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own value, a woman who had outgrown the small, suffocating world that had tried to bury her. The good twin is dead, Seojin, Jane said, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. I think it's time I saw what the rest of the world looks like for a woman who isn't afraid to be herself. The elevator doors opened to the rooftop, the wind whipping Jane's white suit as the helicopter's blades began to roar. The city lights were flickering on below, a million stars for a woman who was no longer a ghost. She stepped onto the pad, the dragon at her side, not as a savior, but as a partner. Jane Raymond took a deep breath of the cold, night air, the first breath of a life that was entirely, undeniably her own. She was no longer the reliable one, the jilted one, or the shadow. She was the protagonist of her own story, and for the first time, she couldn't wait to see what happened in the next chapter. Jane finally realized that her goodness wasn't a weakness. It was a prize that her twin and Terrence simply didn't earn. If you've ever been the one to carry everyone else on your back only to be let down, let this be your sign to start choosing yourself. Drop a fire in the comments if you cheered for Jane's comeback. I want to know, what is one boundary you are setting for yourself this week? Also, if you know a Jane in your life who needs to hear that she is enough, share this video with her. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of justice and transformation. Because at the end of the day, you can either be the one who fixes everyone else's world or the one who finally rules your own. We're Afro Soul Mafia Stories, and I'll see you in the next story.